Hello everyone, we are continuing on our week and module on paper, and we have already looked at the aspects in Mughal miniature paintings, a part of Deccan miniatures, and then of course the ones in the earlier stage, for example the Chora Panchasika style and so on. So today we'll be discussing more on the Rajput and Pahari miniature paintings, and then we'll conclude the session with some of the more recent ones, for example the painting practices in Tanjore and Mysore. So starting with the Rajput and Pahari paintings, I'll first touch upon the Rajput one. So the Rajput paintings are the ones we know, and those were produced by the courts which were ruled by the Rajput rulers, and that is mostly the areas that we understand today in part of northwestern India, in Rajasthan, in western India. And we see that there have been many courts in this area. So these are the places which were ruled by the Rajputs. So for example, we have this very important court of Mewar, then we have Bikaner, and then Kota, and so on. So there have been many of these courts, the smaller kingdoms we find in this Rajput dominated areas, and in many times we found that they were not in agreement with the Mughals, and that is the reason the Mughals and the Rajputs were in constant warfare. We have seen the similar kind of thing even in the earlier times during the Sultanate period and all. So some of the Rajput dominated these kingdoms will find them to have been under the dominance of the Mughals or the other the sultanates or other kingdoms. However, some of the ones, for example Mewar and all, we see them to be fiercely independent, and they have been independent states until very late times. So that kind of political changes or this specific political character of these states, they have also contributed towards the specificity or the individual approaches of these painting practices. So when we are looking into the western India or like northwestern India, for example Rajasthan, like the Rajput kingdoms, so this is not really that far from the places where we have seen the other kind of painting practices, for example the Jaina Kalpasutra and Kalakacharya Katha, those manuscripts from Gujarat, from the central India, from Malwa and so on. And also the same time when we see the Chora Panchasika style, so the Chora Panchasika style in the central India, part of western India, even some of the Chora Panchasika manuscripts were also produced in the places that we know today as Rajasthan, the Rajput dominated areas. So all of them have tremendous amount of influence on the way Rajput paintings have also shaped over the time. This approach towards painting, for example the angularity, and then the application of flat colors, and then an eye for detail when it comes to ornamentation, when it comes to depicting different motifs in a tree and so on. So these things that we have already seen to be established in the Chora Panchasika style and the Jaina, the manuscripts, will find them to be also prevalent in the Rajput miniature paintings. Now if we go with that, there are also some of the things in the later times when we see that some of the Rajput courts, they have close correlation with the Mughals. So that time we will find that there are exchange of artisans between these courts, and the artisans who were trained in the Mughal court, they will travel to the Rajput courts, and that is how we'll find that how certain kind of exchange of influences, exchange of painterly practices, they also made a huge impact on the way the Rajput paintings have shaped over time. So going with the similarities and differences, we can see that this kind of issues, they appear to be the decisive factors for how Rajput paintings, the way we perceive them today. Now another thing we also find that even though the Rajput paintings and the Mughal paintings, we see them growing almost side by side if we think about the areas which were under the Mughal rule, and then of course like some of the smaller kingdoms where the Rajput rule was established, and in some cases when the Rajput rulers were also, they were subordinate to the Mughals. So in all these cases we find that in the Mughal context we see the miniature painting practices, the figurative miniature painting practices, they were practiced, but the kind of murals that we see in some of the Mughal monuments, for example, Akbar's tomb in Sikandra and then Itimaduddaulah and places like that. So they are mostly floral and geometrical, whereas when we come to the Rajput mural making practices, we find some of the murals, for example, the one we have on screen, this entire pavilion that we find that is called Chitrashala, that is there in the Royal Fort complex of Bundi in Rajasthan. It is profusely painted, and at the same time we also have figurative scenes, narrative figurative scenes in the murals, which is not present in the Mughal context. So that also gives us a sense of, like, I mean, this entire debate around representing figurative motifs in the Islamic context and how that is different perhaps for, you know, for the Rajput rulers. However, we should not be relying on too much of generalization, but as we can see that, I mean, with the figurative motifs were celebrated in the Mughal manuscripts and miniature paintings, they were not preferred, certainly for many reasons, in the murals, whereas in the Rajput paintings we find that the murals and the miniatures, both of them, they had this tendency towards depicting high figurative narrations. Now, also that what were the thematics in which, like, I mean, they have performed. So we find that, I mean, there were some of the thematics which were more common in the Rajput paintings than of the Mughal paintings, and some of them, for example, we find them to be like the Dev Bhagavata, the Bhagavata Purana, and then of course the Ragamala paintings. Now in the left side of our screen we have one image from a Ragamala painting. And what is Ragamala? So we have been touching upon this term from the early part of this week, but, like, I mean, I saved this discussion until this time because Ragamala is a kind of painting, a very specific kind of painting where we find that there are depiction of the musical notes. So musical notes, or the ragas, as we know, these very specific and highly specialized notes of music which is practiced in mostly in the northern India. And so the ragas, and of course, I mean, there are also the ragas in southern India, but usually the way we see the Ragamala paintings, most of the ragas, their notes and their timing and everything, they are referred to the Hindustani music than of to the southern Indian music. So what we have there, that all the ragas and the musical notes, they have something to do with creating a particular kind of mood. So if they are creating a mood, or then the receivers, they experience the rasa. So we find that different kind of rasa is communicated by these musical notes, and that is the reason we have different kinds of these ragas which evoke different kind of rasa, and at the same time we also find that they are related to particular seasons or time of the day. For example, the Malhar or Megha Malhar, these are the ragas, we find them to be associated with monsoon, whereas there are also different kind of ragas and raginis, for example Vairava, so that is the raga for morning. So this kind of, like, I mean, this very specific the temporalities which are associated with ragas, at the same time the kind of mood those are created by the ragas, those things are celebrated in both Rajput and Pahari miniature paintings. To some extent we find them in the Deccan miniature paintings as well, but in the Rajput miniature paintings we see them to be of course, I mean, both in Rajput and Pahari paintings we find them to be much more prevalent. And here in the left side of the screen we have an image of the Asavari Ragini, and Asavari Ragini is a Ragini which is usually considered to be depicted by a woman in the wilderness, and she is dressed like a person who dwells in the forest, and that's the reason in this image we find there is a dark skinned woman sitting at the center stage, and she wears peacock feathers, and which does not really look like someone from a court, but someone who dwells in the forest. And then she is in the middle of the wilderness, which is and is surrounded by a rocky landscape, not really lush green vegetation or a pleasurable garden setting that we find. And then what we also see that, I mean, she is holding a snake, and something that is also a very characteristic feature of the images of Asavari Ragini. So here in this image we find that, I mean, how it is also similar to the Mughal miniatures and the earlier manuscript, that the painting and writing practices, they are continued side by side. So there is description, there are the written delineation of the ragas and raginis, and then we have the visuals. So, and where like the text and the visual, they complement each other for us to have a much more a fully developed sense of the prime characteristics of these ragas and raginis. And even in this one we find that, I mean, the area which shows the sky is only relegated to the top. This thin register which shows the sky, and rest of the area is the rocky landscape, the rocky terrain, and where there are different kinds of animals. If we see the kind of style which has been incorporated here, so this is very much like the Chaura Panchasika style, where the angularity of the face, and then like, I mean, the flat application of color, a very clever and playful way of putting contrasting colors side by side. For example, this red background against the main protagonist of this painting, that is Asavari Ragini. So that kind of contrasting color, at the same time this flat application of color, and the dominance of lines and different kind of ornamentation. So those things are also something that we find them to be very much prevalent here, and we can see the lasting presence of the Chaura Panchasika style in these paintings here as well. So this is an image which was painted by Nasiruddin. So Nasiruddin was a prominent painter in the Mewar court, along with Sahibdin and so on. And this is an image which was painted in Mewar and in 1605, perhaps around 1605. So that is the very early decade of the 17th century. So slowly we find, with the interaction with the Mughals, and then also with exposure to different kind of art styles around the northern and central India, the Rajput style had also become refined, and we see that, I mean, there are many different kind of experimentations those took place. So for example, the kind of space division we find in the Mughal context, and similar kind of space division, and then this multiple point of view which are all brought together in one painting to have this different narrative segments together. Prime characteristic that we also find in the Mughal miniature paintings, that is also there in the Rajput paintings here as well. So this is an image that comes from a Bhagavata Purana, and that comes from the state of Bikaner, and this is early 18th century, 1700. And this one here we find that there is a depiction of Krishna and Balarama. They come from the depiction of Bhagavata Purana, and here we find there is a walled complex. So this is a palace complex that we see, that is situated at the center stage of this painting. And then we have like a depiction of landscape. There are registers of trees that sort of like, I mean, gives us a sense of this a forest like landscape. And then there are registers in the register at the bottom, register at the top, where we find that there are different sets of people who are moving towards different directions. So this is something that we find, that how the narrative and its relationship to, like, I mean, the central characters, how all those things play out in this small the pictorial plane of the miniature paintings. And Apart from that, we also find that how certain kind of things, for example, the foreshortening, that the figures that we see them to be in the front or at the center, they are depicted in a bigger scale than the ones which are in the back. And here the foreshortening is not only just dependent on this point of view, but also about the hierarchy, that I mean the who are the people who are of more importance than the others. So those two things, we find them to be seamlessly merged in these paintings here, and that is the reason there is this single point perspectival view, which was perhaps been also brought by the Europeans. And during the time of Shah Jahan, we find that in the Mughal miniature paintings that left a big influence, and that kind of perspectival view, and which is more evident in the way the receding lines of this palace complex is shown. And that is something that also gives us a sense of this single point perspectival view, and how, you know, for architecture and everything around it, they need to be adjusted according to their distance from the point of view of the artisans, right. So if those are the things we find, that I mean some of these European perspectival views, which were perhaps first studied by the Mughal court artisans, and then those were transported to the Rajput court. So if those things are there, but at the same time there are certain, you know, certain sensibility towards depicting the subject matter, at the same time the hierarchy of the figures, that who's more important than someone else. So those things which were more indigenous practices, they are also seamlessly merged with this newly found interventions. At the same time, if we also see the color scheme, we find that to be much more subdued, much more sort of, the contrast here is much less and much more sort of subtle compared to the other image that we have seen from Mewar, the Asavari Ragini. And that also perhaps happened because of, as we see the, like I mean in Bikaner, we find that the more painters from this court, they had more close correlation with the Mughal court because of their close alliance. And that is perhaps also a reason what we find, that the paintings produced in Bikaner, they had this distinctive sort of this subtlety and the refinement, which can be closely related to the ones which were produced in the Mughal court. Now with time, we find that two kinds of themes have also been prominent in the Rajput paintings, and that is, if we think about it, that one will be the bhakti related themes and the other is courage or valor. And so in terms of bhakti, we find that in the fort of Chittor, this legendary singer and saint Mirabai, she was a very influential one for the bhakti movement, in not only in the places which are ruled by the Rajput, but all over northern India. So that is the reason we find the bhakti related, the themes, they have flourished significantly in the courts of Rajasthan. And at the same time, the Rajputs, for their close relationship to warfare, hunting and everything else, we find that there are images which depict hunting scenes and elaborate war scenes and so on. So with time, we find that in the 18th century, these two examples that we have here in the slide side by side. So the one in the left, that was produced in the court of Kishangarh, and perhaps it was painted by Nihal Chand, the court artist of Sawan Singh. And then what we find in the court of Kishangarh is that they were the worshippers of Krishna and Radha, and that is how Sawan Singh and his consort Bani Thani, they were perceived as manifestations of Krishna and Radha. And that is how we find how the portraits which were made of this royals, they almost look ethereal. They did not look like someone who's there in the as part of the physical reality, but they are more a part of the spiritual realm. So the artisans during this time, for example, the master artisans as Nihal Chand, we find them to base their paintings on the observation of these royal characters as Sawan Singh and Bani Thani, but they have also managed to take these observations to the realm of the spirituality, and that is how the characters of the figures we find, for example, this lotus like eyes, this slight smile in the face, and this particular kind of stylization which suggests that they are no ordinary beings, but they are perhaps in the they are semi-divine beings. So that kind of character was imbibed in these paintings. So if this is one set of painting that we find which deal with the bhakti related themes, on the other hand we also find images, for example here the one we have in the right side of the screen, and here we have a hunting scene from the kingdom of Kota. So Kota paintings are also celebrated for the themes related to hunting, and these elaborate scenes in which we find there is forest setting and with elaborate and minute depiction of the flora. And then we have the hunting scenes where we do not really just see the characters, the royals who are hunting, but also different kinds of moods and expressions and dynamism in the bodies of both the animals and the human beings. So that way we find the hunting scene specifically in Kota, which talks about the Rajput bravery and courage and valor. So those ones we also find that to be highly expressive and dynamic in their depiction. Also here please note the use of this particular register which shows the sky. So the sky is again like relegated to the upper part of the image, and it is not really given much space in the pictorial plane. So from there we'll move on to talk about the paintings in the Pahari region. And Pahari, when I say Pahari region, that basically means the Punjab hills. So the areas today we understand as part of Himachal Pradesh, part of northern Punjab and so on. And so those are the areas in which we also find there were some of those smaller kingdoms, and there we find that the painting practices have also flourished. So in the Pahari region, perhaps the most important kingdom will be the state will perhaps be of Kangra. And Kangra, there is this fort, perhaps one of the oldest surviving forts in the Indian subcontinent, that comes from 8th century AD. The Kangra fort has been a center of power struggles for more than a millennia now. So for that reason we find that for its prominence in this Pahari region, for Kangra fort, the rulers and the struggle for dominance over this Kangra fort, the entire Kangra state had been very active in terms of different kind of literary and visual expressions and different kind of building projects as well. Now this is perhaps one of the earliest surviving paintings or like the manuscript that we find from the Pahari region, and this is the depiction of Devi Mahatmya, and Devi Mahatmya that came from Jaisinghpur in Kangra, and this was produced perhaps around the time 1552. So it is mid 16th century that we find, and this is, as I have said, that this is perhaps one of the earliest surviving Pahari manuscript that we have with us. So what we have here, it's a very characteristic kind of this horizontal scroll, horizontal this pothi like format and the manuscript like format, and in which there is a space for which where the written inscriptions and the narration is there, and then the entire this narration that is framed by the visual narratives. In the left side we have a depiction of Mahishasura Mardini, and where we see the blue skinned goddess, she is slaying the buffalo demon, and then there are angelic figures, the divine figures we find, they are showering flowers and they are greeting the goddess for this heroic deed. And here in the right side we have, there is this other figure, we find perhaps a depiction of monsoon, and for that reason there is a depiction of this dark clouds, a peacock and the raindrops. So in this one we also find there is a very distinctive essence of the Chaura Panchasika style that was prevalent in the central India and also in the western India. So we know that how this Chaura Panchasika style that had emerged in 15th century and that had been such a influential style in various parts of northern, central, western India. So this one is also not an exception from that. So in the Pahari miniature paintings, we find that there are also something distinctive in terms of their approach. So we have that in this region, the Pahari customs, the Hindu customs, that also grew very closely with the Vajrayana Buddhist customs, and here we find that there are different modes of worshipping the great goddess or Devi that had been prevalent. So some of the tantric ideas that we find, those are not really been significantly explored in the Rajasthani miniature paintings and Deccan. So those things we find them to be in the Pahari miniatures, and that is the reason there are many manuscripts and many miniature paintings in which we find there are different deeds of the great goddess and her manifestation in form of Mahishasura Mardini or Bhadrakali and different other forms where the female power is celebrated. And so that also perhaps gave that shaped the ideas about life and death, because many of the tantric practices that they also evolve, they also include a lot of practices which requires a sound understanding of the material body and its relationship to the spiritual realm. So those are the reasons we find that those guiding ideas have also contributed to the making of these paintings. We'll get more on this images and the description of these paintings in the next lecture. Thank you.